It began, as many legends do, with a whisper. In the steaming jungles of the South Pacific, under the metallic hum of mosquitoes and the distant thunder of artillery, a group of American soldiers sat around a battered field radio. The signal was weak, the air heavy with static. Then, out of the noise, a woman's voice drifted in, soft, clear, too calm for war. "Hello, boys. This is your favorite enemy, Tokyo Rose." The men froze. For a moment, it sounded almost like a dream, a ghost reaching through the airwaves. Then came a light laugh, followed by swing music, a familiar rhythm that didn't belong in this place of mud and blood. Glenn Miller, Benny Goodman, tunes from home, the sound of jukeboxes and Friday nights, now echoing in a war zone. When the song ended, the voice returned. "Your sweethearts back home are dancing tonight. Don't worry, boys. The war will be over soon." Some laughed, nudging each other. "She's trying to mess with us." Others stared into the darkness, imagining the faces of women they hadn't seen in years. There was something haunting about it. Not the message itself, but the tone. Playful, intimate, almost kind. It was as if the enemy had found a way to crawl into the most private corners of their hearts. The name spread quickly. Tokyo Rose. It wasn't official, just a nickname born in barracks and trenches. But by 1944, every American soldier in the Pacific knew it. No one could agree on what she sounded like. Some swore she had a Southern accent, others said British. A few insisted she wasn't even real, just a rumor, a psychological trick. But the legend grew, and like all myths, it needed a face. What few knew was that Tokyo Rose wasn't one woman. There were many, English-speaking women forced or persuaded to broadcast for Radio Tokyo, each adding her own spin to the myth. But history would remember only one name, Iva Toguri, an American citizen, a daughter of Japanese immigrants, a woman trapped between two nations at war, who never intended to become anyone's enemy. When the war began, she couldn't leave Japan. She took a job at Radio Tokyo to survive, and when she stepped behind the microphone for the first time, she thought she was just reading jokes and introducing records. She had no idea that her voice would travel across oceans into trenches, cockpits, and memories, and that it would come back to haunt her for the rest of her life. In a world drowning in noise, she was the calm in the storm. In a war defined by hate, her voice, strangely, sounded human. "This is 0 Hour, boys. Sit back, relax, enjoy the show." The static swallowed her words, carrying them into the dark Pacific night, where they mixed with the crash of waves, the hum of engines, and the silent question in every soldier's mind. Who was she really? And why did her voice feel so familiar? Before she was Tokyo Rose, she was simply Iva Toguri Dakino, a bright, stubborn young woman from Los Angeles. Born to Japanese immigrant parents, Eva grew up as American as anyone else. She went to school in California, listened to swing music, studied zoology at UCLA, and dreamed of becoming a doctor. She loved baseball, hamburgers, and jazz records, not exactly the makings of an enemy of the state. But in 1941, she made a decision that would change her life forever. She sailed to Japan to visit her sick aunt, a trip meant to last a few months. Then, on December 7th, the world changed. Pearl Harbor was bombed. The United States and Japan were at war, and Iva was trapped. A 25-year-old American woman suddenly declared an enemy alien in the land of her ancestors. Her American passport was confiscated. She refused to renounce her citizenship, even when pressured by Japanese officials. And because of that defiance, she was branded disloyal by both sides. Jobs were hard to find for a woman marked as the wrong kind of foreigner, so she survived on ration cards, tutoring, and odd office work until she found herself in a broadcasting job at Radio Tokyo, where English speakers were desperately needed. At first, it was simple: reading the news, playing music, editing scripts. Then she met a group of Allied prisoners of war who were forced to help with propaganda programming. Together, they formed something unexpected: a quiet rebellion through humor. The show was called Zero Hour. Officially, it was propaganda meant to demoralize Allied troops. In reality, it became something stranger: a bizarre mix of swing tunes, mock serious news, and sarcastic jokes that even the soldiers listening could tell weren't meant to be taken seriously. "Hello, boys," she'd tease. "You really think you're going to win this war on coffee and cigarettes?" It was sharp, ironic, even playful, and it drove Japanese censors insane. She refused to read the harsher scripts that directly attacked America. She refused to call herself Tokyo Rose. But the myth was already spreading. Thousands of miles away, Allied reporters and soldiers began attributing all broadcasts, from any female voice with an accent to the same mysterious woman. The legend of Tokyo Rose had been born, and Eva, unknowingly, had become its unwilling face. What made her story tragic wasn't just what she said, but what others heard. Her light-hearted tone, her jokes, her refusal to sound like a monster. All of it blurred the line between traitor and survivor, between voice and symbol, between woman and myth. By 1944, her voice had become more famous than her name. Across the Pacific, American soldiers tuned their radios to catch the show, partly out of curiosity, partly out of boredom, and partly because Zero Hour was the only English broadcast that made them feel, if just for a moment, less alone. "This is your favorite enemy," she'd start playfully. "You boys must be tired of fighting. How about a song to remind you of home?" Then the music would play: swing, jazz, love ballads. The sound of New York and Chicago bleeding through the static of a Tokyo broadcast. Officially, the Japanese military designed Zero Hour to crush morale, to make Allied soldiers homesick, doubtful, and afraid. But Iva Toguri and her POW friends turned it into something else. They loaded the scripts with jokes, sarcasm, and deliberate exaggerations. One prisoner later said, "We made it sound ridiculous, so the boys listening would know we were mocking it." But irony doesn't always survive the noise of war. What began as humor was soon heard as treason. Soldiers returning home wrote about Tokyo Rose in letters and memoirs. They described her as clever, beautiful, dangerous, sometimes all at once. The newspapers picked up the myth, adding mystery and menace to every word. Back in Japan, Eva barely noticed the legend growing around her. She earned barely enough to eat, lived in a small apartment, and was often hungry. For her, Zero Hour wasn't politics, it was survival. But for the men in Washington and San Francisco, it became a symbol of something far larger. Every war creates its own ghosts, and Tokyo Rose became one of them. A phantom voice blamed for every rumor, every piece of propaganda that unsettled American troops. No matter who she was, the myth had already chosen her face. When Japan surrendered in 1945, the airwaves went silent. No more songs, no teasing laughter, no "hello boys." But across the Pacific, the silence didn't bring peace. It brought questions. Who was she really? Was she American or Japanese? A traitor? Or just caught between two flags? In the ruins of Tokyo, Iva Toguri didn't know that a storm was already heading her way. Reporters were arriving. The FBI was listening. And the woman who had spent years trapped by circumstance was about to become trapped by her own legend. What had started as a job behind a microphone was about to turn into a national trial, not for what she had done, but for what people believed she represented. When the guns went silent and Japan surrendered, the myth of Tokyo Rose didn't fade. It exploded. Reporters from the U.S. flooded Tokyo, hungry for stories of villains, collaborators, and redemption. And in the middle of the ruins, they found her. A small woman in a patterned dress, polite, tired, still smiling. She didn't hide. She didn't run. When journalists asked if she was Tokyo Rose, she shrugged and said she'd worked at Radio Tokyo. Yes, she'd done 0 Hour. She didn't realize that confession would destroy her life. Within days, her name was on every front page. Tokyo Rose found. Voice of the enemy captured. To the American public, still raw from the war, she was no longer Iva Toguri. She was the Tokyo Rose, the voice that had mocked their sons and husbands in the jungle. No one cared that she'd never called herself that. No one cared that her broadcasts had been mild, even humorous. They needed someone to blame. And now they had a face. She was arrested by American authorities in Japan, held for a year without charges, and then released due to lack of evidence. But her freedom didn't last. When she returned to the United States in 1948, political pressure and public anger forced the government to act again. The Cold War was beginning. America wanted to prove its moral purity. So they decided to make an example. The charge? Treason. Only a handful of Americans in history had ever faced it, and none had been women. The trial in San Francisco became a spectacle. Microphones, cameras, crowds. Former soldiers testified that her voice had shaken morale. Prosecutors painted her as a cunning seductress who had served the emperor through words. But the truth was thinner than the headlines. The FBI had little concrete evidence. The scripts used in court were incomplete. Witnesses contradicted each other. And years later, some admitted they had been pressured to lie. Still, in the climate of fear and patriotism, facts mattered less than feeling. In September 1949, Iva Toguri was convicted of treason on one count. For a single broadcast no one could even fully verify. She was sentenced to 10 years in prison and a $10,000 fine. As the verdict was read, she didn't cry. She bowed her head slightly, as if listening to a song only she could hear. Behind bars, she became quiet again. The voice that had once crossed oceans now reduced to silence. She spent 6 years in prison before being released for good behavior in 1956. By then, the world had moved on. The soldiers who once listened to her now had families, new wars, new fears. But Iva never forgot. She once told a reporter, "All I ever wanted was to live honestly. I never wanted to be anyone's enemy." When the prison gates opened in 1956, Iva Toguri stepped out quietly, carrying a small suitcase and a name the world still hated. There were no crowds waiting, no cheers, only a few journalists, still chasing the ghost of Tokyo Rose. She tried to start over in Chicago, working at her father's shop, J. Toguri Mercantile. But business was hard when the neighborhood believed you were a traitor. Customers whispered, children pointed. Her family, once respected, became targets of vandalism and threats. For years, Iva lived in near silence. She avoided interviews, avoided politics, avoided attention. Even her voice, once broadcast across the Pacific, became soft, careful, deliberate. Yet those who met her said she never carried bitterness. She loved to laugh, to talk about music, to joke about her broken Japanese and her stubborn English. She had spent 6 years behind bars, but her spirit hadn't rusted. In the 1960s, the world began to change. America, in the shadow of Vietnam and civil unrest, started to question its past. Journalists began digging into her case, and what they found shocked them. The FBI files were incomplete. Key witnesses recanted their testimony, admitting that government agents had pressured them to lie. One said, "We were told to make sure she was convicted, no matter what." The tide of history was slowly shifting. In 1976, nearly 30 years after her trial, new investigations by journalists and historians exposed how the Tokyo Rose story had been built more on myth than fact. And that same year, on her 60th birthday, something extraordinary happened. President Gerald Ford signed a presidential pardon for Iva Toguri d'Aquino, formally clearing her of treason. It was a small piece of paper, but it carried decades of weight. When reporters surrounded her after the news broke, she smiled softly, the same half-smile she had worn in 1945. "I'm very happy," she said simply. "It's been a long time." No anger, no victory speech, just peace, the kind that comes only when a wound has finally stopped bleeding. In the years that followed, she lived quietly, teaching, volunteering, and occasionally speaking to students about truth, loyalty, and the dangers of hysteria. She never claimed to be a hero. She never claimed to be innocent of everything. But she wanted people to understand one thing. I was an American. I stayed loyal. And I survived by using my voice, not my silence. When she died in 2006, she was remembered not as Tokyo Rose, but as Iva Toguri, the woman who refused to hate the country that once condemned her. In the end, she didn't just outlive the myth, she rewrote it. Behind those steel bars, Iva Toguri learned the most painful truth of all, that freedom isn't only about walls. It's about the story people tell about you. In America, her name became a cautionary tale. In Japan, it was barely remembered. To most, she was neither hero nor villain, just a whisper carried by old radio waves. But the broadcasts she made, the same ones that condemned her, never truly vanished. Archivists would later find fragments of them, scratchy, fading tapes filled with music, laughter, and the unmistakable warmth of her voice. In one of them, she says softly, "Wherever you are, boys, good night and good luck." The line wasn't in the propaganda script. It wasn't approved by her superiors. It was hers. A message not of hate, but of humanity, smuggled through the static of war. That small act, like a flicker in the dark, is what history almost erased. When we talk about war, we talk about battles and generals, victory and defeat, but rarely about the ones caught between languages, loyalties, and lies, people who belonged to two worlds and were trusted by neither. Iva Toguri was one of them. She wasn't a spy. She wasn't a traitor. She was a woman trapped by circumstance and turned into a legend by those who needed an enemy. And yet, even in that legend, there's something hauntingly human. A reminder that propaganda isn't just what governments create, it's what societies choose to believe. In her final years, Eva would sometimes receive letters from veterans, men who had once listened to her broadcasts from foxholes and ships. They wrote to thank her, not accuse her. Some said her voice had made them laugh when nothing else could. Others said it made them remember home. One letter read simply, "We knew you were one of us." Maybe that's the truest ending of her story. Not the trial, not the prison, but that single moment of recognition, after decades of silence, that she had never really been the enemy. As the last generation of soldiers faded, so did the memory of Tokyo rose. But on certain nights, historians say, you can still find recordings of 0 hour drifting across old frequencies, faint, ghost-like, barely audible beneath the static. A woman's voice, calm, warm, and just a little mischievous. This is your favorite enemy, signing off. The war ended long ago, but her echo, her defiance, her survival, her humanity never did.